to talk about the archaeology of Easter, a passion of mine. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm the pastor here. Most of you know me. In that role, I also am a staff researcher and writer with the Associates for Biblical Research. ABR is how we shorten that. And they are a group of archaeologists and scholars based out of the United States. And they're the ones who lead the dig at Shiloh, Israel every year. They've led the digs now. This is our third site that we've excavated, I believe. Khirbet Nissia, Khirbet El Makader, and now Shiloh, or Shiloh. If you are in Israel, that's how they refer to it, is as Shiloh. And I also run my own blog at BibleArchaeologyReport.com, and we'll talk a little bit more about that afterwards. Lord willing, in about 2 months, I will be in Israel excavating again at Shiloh. And so my wife and I are planning to go. And so we would appreciate your prayers for provision, protection, and providence. By providence, I mean this. What we do, I think, is really important. Let me maybe put it into a context that we at Island Bible Chapel can understand. We are familiar with Kirk Durston and his work in apologetics. And Kirk frequently makes use of different types of arguments. And one of the ones that he uses, he was telling me, is a whole presentation just on biblical archaeology. And so part of what our work is we do the archaeology, and we are an apologetics organization as well. But other apologists can then use our information as well. And so it's not just us using it. And so just for our context, you can kind of see where this kind of information might be used. Now, our goals tonight, I've got a few goals in where we're going. And when we get to the end, save your questions to the end if you can, because I'm going to have a Q&A time at the end that you can ask me questions about. The first is I want to review the accounts of the death and the resurrection of Jesus. And I want to use both the biblical text, and then I want to compare it with archaeology or history. And what do we know about those two things? The second thing is my goal here is to demonstrate the historical reliability of the Easter story in the Gospels, which are eyewitness accounts. And I think that that's an important point, that if we're ever talking to someone about Easter, if we're talking to them about the resurrection, that we keep coming back to that particular point. These are eyewitness accounts. One of the things that I often point out, especially when I talk to young people, is that the gospel accounts of Jesus' life, his death, and his resurrection are not set in a fictional world. This is not the world of Narnia or Middle Earth. These are actual places, authentic people. This is accurate history being recorded. The apostles would write things like this: that which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked at and have touched with our hands concerning the word of life. This is what I'm going to proclaim to you, John would write at the beginning of his epistle, 1 John. What you may not know is that what John is appealing to there are the three main categories of legitimate testimony in Greco-Roman legal courts: what you can see, what you've heard, what you can touch. Those were the three categories of evidence that could be admitted. And it's almost as if John recognizes that as he goes around and talks about the resurrection and Jesus and his teaching, people are going to object to this. And it's like he's saying, no, I'm giving you an eyewitness account, and I'm going to tell you about the things that we saw, the things we heard, the things we touched. This is real, legitimate testimony. Peter, another eyewitness to the resurrection, writes, we did not follow cleverly devised myths when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but were eyewitnesses of his majesty. Matthew, yet another eyewitness, describes meeting the resurrected Jesus as just before Jesus ascended into heaven. So we have this eyewitness thing over and over. If you read the book of Acts, you will see that the apostles hammer on this over and over. We were eyewitnesses. And I think that's an important point to make. And finally, what I want to do is I want to ultimately encourage you and build up your faith, particularly if you have doubts. Maybe you don't have doubts, but you know someone who does. And so this will help prepare you by giving you some answers to talk to them. The first thing I'd like to do is I'd like to do a little bit of myth busting. now that it's Easter, much like at Christmas, people seem to come out of the woodwork to make claims that Easter has pagan roots. And one of the ones that I see regularly is it was originally a celebration of the goddess Ishtar, or the goddess Ostera. And if this is news to you, just let me share this with you, because you will see it on social media, but sadly, this is also creeping into the church. People who are trying to be pious, I think, to give them the benefit of the doubt, are wanting to shy away from saying, well, Easter, that's just, we can't even call it Easter. They seem to be hung up on the word. And so I think that it's important to do a little bit of myth busting here. And so just so you know, the celebration of the death and resurrection of Jesus is the oldest festival Christians celebrate. Right from the beginning, Christians have celebrated and honored the death and the resurrection of Jesus. In fact, in our part of the world, if you think of how long our celebrations are and lead up to it, we tend to celebrate Christmas maybe with more vigor than Easter, arguably. But Christmas, the celebration of Christmas, isn't something that we read about in the earlier church. It's a little bit later. Certainly by the 2nd, 3rd century, we start getting glimpses of this. But Easter goes right back to the beginning. In fact, a little fun fact for you, there was a great debate in the early church over when you were to celebrate the resurrection of Jesus. Are you to celebrate the resurrection of Jesus on Nisan the 14th, which is the Jewish calendar, which is the day Passover began? And we remember that Jesus died just before Passover, right? They broke his legs. They were going to break his legs, but he was already killed. They broke the legs of the other people because they wanted to get them off the cross before Passover, but Jesus, of course, was already dead. And so we have this one group in the church saying, no, we have to celebrate it on Nisan the 14th. Then another group that said, no, we celebrate it on the Sunday after Nisan the 14th. So the one date stays the same. The other date floats through the calendar year, depending on when Nisan the 14th happens, what day it happens to be, and how many days after that is it. And this was a great debate in the early church. In fact, sad to say, there were sometimes huge schisms and people, one group excommunicating the other group, and all over which day you celebrated the resurrection. The point I'm trying to make is that Easter is not something that was invented a lot later. This is something that goes right back to the very beginning of time. In terms of Ishtar and Ostera, there absolutely is literally no evidence, zero. And I'm not exaggerating. There literally is zero evidence to associate Easter with Ishtar. It's just a similarity of names. And so it's ridiculous to make that sort of a claim. The other one is Ostera, and there is one reference, only one from history, from the 7th century, from a monk who talks about Ostera month being a month that they celebrated a goddess named Ostera. It's the only reference to this goddess in history. We don't know anything about her or who worshipped her or anything. And he notes that eventually that month, that Ostera came to be associated with Easter, with our celebration, because we celebrated in the same month. Not that we're associating it with that particular goddess. It's just that they were the same names. And some people would even say that that's not even the roots, that the actual root of the word Easter comes from the German Oster, whose root is os, and it just means east or to shine or the dawn, or from the word Ostern, which I think is most realistic, which derives from the old Germanic form of Ostern, which means resurrection. That seems to me to make the most logical sense where we came. But here's the thing. I don't get my knickers in a knot over the word Easter. You'll say, well, it's not in the Bible. No, it's not. Neither is the word Trinity, and yet we believe it. Neither is the word guitar, but I play one once a month here when I lead worship. Just because it's not in the Bible doesn't mean that the concept and the celebration isn't there. And so I think we need to be really careful, particularly those of us in the church, that we don't start spreading misinformation, even if it's well-intentioned. And so this idea that Easter has pagan roots is a gross misunderstanding of history and I think misinformation. And so I'm going to call it Easter. And the reason I'm going to call it Easter is because when I talk to people down on the street in Richards Landing, you know what they call it? Easter. So I'm going to speak the language of the culture that I'm in, and I'm going to point them to Jesus about Easter rather than the Easter bunny. With that said, I promised that there were going to be 10 discoveries that I think demonstrate the historic reliability of the New Testament when it comes to the accounts of the death and the resurrection of Jesus. And I even teased you on, say it was shameless, it really was, how I teased you that there was one little known one, and I'm going to start right off the bat with it, okay? So I'll just be right off the bat with it. It'll be the second one we do, but it's all kind of related to the same thing. We're going to talk about the Garden of Gethsemane. The Garden of Gethsemane, the Bible says that Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, sit here while I go over there and pray. And so the Bible actually never uses the phrase Garden of Gethsemane. It uses the phrase Gethsemane. Does anyone know what Gethsemane means? Go ahead, shout it out if you know. Olive press, the place of pressing olives. That's what it means. And so, so we would expect to find somewhere in this area, probably olive trees, because olive presses were located near olive groves, and we would expect to find olive presses, would we not? And so if you go over to Israel today, if you've ever been there, one of the places I do encourage you to go see is the Garden of Gethsemane. It's on the Mount of Olives. We don't know if it's the exact Garden of Gethsemane, but it's probably in the general vicinity, because on this, the eastern or the western slope of the Mount of Olives, that's where you see all these olive trees, and they're very old. Some of them are over 1,000 years old, these trees on the Mount of Olives. And so the Garden of Gethsemane is a great place to go. It's done beautifully. It's very contemplative, if you can get past the lines of the crowds that are also there to contemplate with you as well. And so it's a great place. The description seems to match where we would expect it to be. But here's the place that I really wanted to see. So our last day in Israel, we wanted to go see the Garden of Gethsemane, and I said to Jen, I really want to see this other site. And it's supposed to be nearby. Literally, it's right across the road from it. It's called the Cave of Gethsemane, and this is the little known one. I've talked to guys, even in our organization, had never heard of this place. And the reason I think is because in order to get to it, you have to make your way towards a Catholic shrine to the tomb of the Virgin Mary, probably not the tomb of the Virgin Mary, but the shrine there. But that's how you start there, but then you take a little right, and it's just on your right there. And so a lot of people don't even go near it. Now, this is a very, very interesting place, a very ancient cave. Do you know what they found inside the cave? Olive presses that dated to the 1st century. That makes sense. And when you consider some of the other details in Scripture, it's very interesting. The Bible tells us in the book of John that it was a cold night that night. Seems logical to me that they would have taken shelter in one of the caves that were nearby. But to me, the kicker, the key to it, comes from John 18:4. It says this, Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen, went out. This is when Judas and the people coming to arrest Jesus are coming. Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen, went out and asked them, who is it you want? Did you catch it? Some of you missed it. I'm going to say it again. I'm going to really emphasize the point. Here it is. Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out to talk to them. So there is something in the Garden of Gethsemane that Jesus went out of. What did he go out of? I would suggest to you that he went out of this particular cave. And it's not just me. Joan Taylor is an excellent archaeologist. She's done a lot of work on this. She wasn't the one who did the initial excavations. Those were decades ago. But she's written an important article, I think, that highlights a lot of the evidence that would point to this as a great candidate for the place that I think where the disciples were slumbering. This nice little cave. Now, Jesus may have gone to the Garden of Gethsemane, the area of the current Garden of Gethsemane, because the Bible says he went a stone's throw away. And literally, I could throw a stone and hit someone in the Garden of Gethsemane from standing right outside the cave of Gethsemane. Here's the point. We don't read about mythical places. We're reading about real places. And when we take these clues from the New Testament, they match known places that we see over in Israel that were being used right at that particular time. The Bible says he went to a place called Gethsemane, a place of the oil press. What do we find? Right next to an olive grove, a cave with an oil press. That's not a coincidence. Now, maybe it was another cave nearby. Maybe there's another oil press nearby. I don't know. But what I'm saying is that we're talking about real places here that are authentic to the first century. Here's the next one. An ossuary. Before I describe this, I need to just tell you what an ossuary is. If you missed out on Sunday, here's just a little bit for you. In our world, when somebody dies, quite often they're laid in a casket, the remains laid in a casket, and then we have a funeral, and then we bury the casket. That's how it often happens in our world. In the first century, they would bury them not in the ground. They would bury them, the Jewish people would bury them in rock-cut tombs. And in the rock-cut tomb, there would be, well, I'll show you a picture of that a little later, but they would lay the body on a burial bed, and then a year later, they would come back, they would go back into the tomb, and the body would have decomposed, and all that would be left there were the bones. And they would gather the bones up, and they would put them in these limestone bone boxes that are about this big. Not very big, but they would put them in these limestone bone boxes. That bone box is called an ossuary. Hundreds of them found all through Israel. Now, the neat thing about ossuaries are you can date them to the end of the 1st century BC into the 1st century AD up to the destruction of the temple. They were only used for about 100 years in history. So whenever you find a tomb with an ossuary, you can date it pretty much to the 1st century, so to the time of Jesus. This particular ossuary was discovered in 1990 when there was a construction team that was building a water park. And they were building a water park, and as often happens, the bulldozer plowed through the top of a tomb. They found some ossuaries inside, and one particular ossuary was more ornate. Now, I saw probably 30 ossuaries when I was in Israel, and there was only one that looked like this. Most of them are very plain, just plain limestone with the name scratched on the side. This one is very ornate. And the name on it was Joseph, son of Caiaphas. Now, this is important. Most scholars believe that this is the Caiaphas we read about in Matthew 26:57. Then those who had seized Jesus led him to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and the elders had gathered. Most scholars believe that this is the ossuary of Caiaphas, the high priest who presided over the mock trial or the sham trial of Jesus. Because if you read about the trial of Jesus before the Jewish religious leaders, and you actually learn a little bit about their own policies and rules for trials, you'll realize that they didn't do things properly when they tried Jesus here. Josephus notes for us that Caiaphas's full name was Joseph Caiaphas, that Joseph was his main name, Caiaphas was his family name, and he went by his family name in much the same way that the different Herods went by their family names. So if you ever get confused reading the New Testament, and you're like, oh, I thought Herod the Great died. Now I'm at another Herod. Oh, now I'm at another Herod. Yeah, that's because one is Antipas, one's Agrippa, one's a second Agrippa. They went by Herod. They went by their family name. It appears that Caiaphas did the same thing. Interesting. Inside this bone box, there were the bones of several people. They would use them for several people in the same family, including the bones of a 60-year-old man. And many scholars believe those are the bones, the earthly physical remains of Caiaphas himself. And if that's correct, and I think it is, that's the only earthly physical remains we have of anybody mentioned in the Bible, which is a pretty important thing. Again, the point that I want to make is that when we read about someone named Caiaphas, who's a high priest, We come along, we see an ossuary that is very ornate. We have lots of writings about Caiaphas and Josephus and other writings so that we know that he was indeed a high priest. And when we compare the Bible to the historical and the archaeological, at the points where they connect, they align. And I think that's an important point to make. Well, from Caiaphas, we're told that they bound Jesus and they led him away and delivered him over to Pilate, the governor. Pilate said to them, "What shall I do with Jesus, who is called Christ?" And they all said, "Let him be crucified. Let him be crucified. Crucify him." And Pontius Pilate is well known from history. Again, we have lots of people who write about him: Josephus, Tacitus, Philo. Philo really did not like Pilate. If you read any of Philo's writings, he does not. He has a whole list of very negative adjectives to describe him, and so we have lots of evidence in the literary world about Pontius Pilate, but archaeological evidence for him was discovered in 1961 at Caesarea Maritima. Now, in Israel at the time, if you Caesarea on the coast, as opposed to Caesarea Philippi and a number of other places that were called Caesarea, named after Caesar. That was the thing to do in the ancient world, was name something after Caesar. They were excavating a theater, and they were taking apart the steps. And when they took apart the steps and took this limestone block off that was being used as a step, they flipped it over and discovered there was an inscription on it, and it was Pontius Pilate's name. And so it's been reconstructed to read Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea, and the first line says Tiberium. So we don't know what that is. Some structure dedicated to Tiberius Caesar, certainly. But we have here evidence, archaeological evidence of Pontius Pilate. Just a couple of years ago, one of the reasons I love following along with archaeology is it was 2, maybe 3 years ago, they discovered a ring with Pilate's name on, in Latin, Pilatus, of Pilatus. And Pilate is a very rare name in the ancient world. And because of where it was found and the archaeological context, they think it belonged probably to one of Pilate's servants, is probably just because of the way the grammar is on the ring. But again, another tangible thing pointing us to Pilate. But there's no doubt that this Pilate in this stone is absolutely the Pilate who Jesus stood before. And we're told that Jesus was taken into the praetorium. This is the governor's residence. And they led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters. Literally, the praetorium was in the early morning. They themselves, the Jewish people, did not enter the governor's headquarters, so they would not be defiled. So the question has always been, where is the praetorium? Because the Roman governor didn't live in Jerusalem. His home base was Caesarea on the coast, Caesarea Maritima. So where did he live when he came to Jerusalem? Because he came to Jerusalem regularly. And for a while they thought that Pilate, the governor, all the Roman governors, because they served for a variety of years, would have stayed in the Antonia Fortress, which was the Roman barracks or the Roman watchtower where they watched over the Jews. Particularly, it was attached to the end of the temple, and so they could keep an eye on the Jews during the religious festivals so that nobody would revolt. But ancient writers tell us that like Josephus and Philo again, tell us that the Roman governors used Herod's old palace. Now, how did they get a hold of that? Well, does anyone remember Herod the Great's son who reigned after him? He's mentioned once in the Bible with the story of Jesus as a baby. His name was Herod Archelaus. And Archelaus was a horrible ruler. In fact, he was so bad that the Jews petitioned Caesar, sent a delegation to say, get rid of him. And Caesar, sensing that all was not well in Judea, got rid of Archelaus and came and confiscated everything that belonged to Herod in Jerusalem, including Herod's palace. Well, now Rome had a wonderful place for their governors to stay when they went to Jerusalem. Herod's palace can only be seen in just a couple of places in Israel today. If you go to the Tower of David Museum, you'll see the base of one of the three main towers that were on the northern part of Herod the Great's palace. We went into the Tower of David Museum, and I really wanted to see this particular place. This is called the Kishla. The Kishla is an Ottoman era prison. And so, but the beautiful thing about it is it's got different layers going down. And so you can see this is Turkish layer, the Ottoman layer, and then it goes down through history, down into the Roman era, so the Herodian stuff, and even down, there's one wall right over here that goes down, that even goes down to the first temple period. Now in this picture, where you want to look is right down here. This wall right here, and this one right over here are the Herodian walls that form a platform on which they built the palace of Herod the Great. And right down here at the bottom, there's a little hole where you can see down and a channel going out. They believe that might be one of the sewage channels or one of the water runoff channels that goes out of the palace. This is the remains of the structure that is the Praetorium. Almost all scholars agree on that now. And this would be the remains of the place. We don't know whereabouts in it. It was a massive palace. But that's where Jesus would have been crucified, or would have been tried, rather, by Pontius Pilate when he was taken to the Praetorium. We read that Jesus was crucified, and we know a lot about crucifixion from ancient writers, but archaeological evidence for crucifixion was discovered in 1968 when a construction crew dug up an ossuary, a bone vault, dug up a tomb, and they found an ossuary in it, and in was inscribed on it was the name Yehohanan, and inside they found the bones of a man who was about in his 20s, and he'd been crucified. There was a nail bone, a nail right through the side of his heel bone, and it was still intact. And this was a huge find because it was the first time archaeological finds had been discovered related to crucifixion. Now, I believe there have been two more. The most recent was just about a year ago, maybe 8 months ago, and it was in Britain. So a couple hundred years later, but in Roman Britain, they discovered another similar discovery. And this is important because for two reasons. Number one, it helps us to understand how they crucified people because it went through the side of his heel bones. So scholars who've studied this think that his feet were, rather than being kind of put in front of him on the front of the cross, likely he was straddled to the cross and his feet were nailed that way in the sides. But more importantly, perhaps, is that it is evidence that someone who was crucified could be given a respectful burial in a grave. Critics have sometimes said of the New Testament, no, they made that up. No, it's because they would have, Jesus was crucified as a criminal. They would have just taken the body and thrown it into a grave with all the other bodies of the criminals. They wouldn't give them a decent burial. But both ancient writings and this discovery show that someone who was crucified could be dignified with a burial, a proper burial. Okay, so I have to warn you about this next one. This next one is going to sound blasphemous and disrespectful, and it is. But it's an important find, and I want to show it to you, and I'll have to explain a little bit of the history here for you. It's called the Alexamenos graffito. It is, today, if people want to do graffiti, it's not nice when they do, but they spray paint on the side of walls, right? You've seen that on walls and underpasses and that kind of thing. In the ancient world, they scratched it into the plaster that was on the walls. And they found this particular scratching in the wall of a house in Rome near the Palatine Hill. And it is a picture of a donkey-headed person being crucified, someone below raising a hand, and the inscription says, Alexamenos worships his God. And scholars believe that this is actually a reference, a picture, an illustration, a mocking one of Jesus on the cross. He's been given a donkey head. And people say, well, why would you even think that that would be Jesus? Well, because if you read some of the ancient writers like Justin Martyr and Tertullian, they talk about how people are accusing the Christians of worshiping donkey-headed God. It's a strange thing to us in our modern world. So this is not out of context. This is historically accurate to what people who were mocking Christians would think. Now, the reason I've included this, though, is because it's a really important, it goes back to, I believe it goes to the 2nd century, is when they've dated it to. And it's important because it helps us to see that very early on in Christianity, people were worshiping the crucified Jesus as God. If you've ever read Dan Brown's novel, The Da Vinci Code, you will have come across the myth that, oh no, that wasn't until hundreds and hundreds of years later when they declared Jesus God at some council. No. Very early on. In fact, it's even in the New Testament, the documents of which were written all before 70 AD. So even within the first decades of Christianity, people are worshiping Jesus as God. We have archaeological evidence of this now with this particular graphic, reminding us of Jesus' crucifixion. I think of 1 Corinthians 1:23, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to the Jew and folly to Gentiles. That's what this illustration shows me, that the view of the Gentiles in Rome at that time was, it's foolish what you believe about Christianity. Well, let's talk about the crucifixion and the burial site. There are a number of pieces of information that are given to us in the Bible. We are told that it's a place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. We're told that it was located outside the city walls, but near the city walls of Jerusalem at the time, that it was near a main road. The Romans usually crucified people near a main road because they wanted to be a deterrent to other people. It was in a garden, and a new tomb had been made there. Those are the clues that we have that we can glean from Scripture. And then when we come to looking for tombs, it's very helpful for us because we know what first century tombs looked like. We have excavated lots of first century tombs in Israel. When we were at Shiloh this year, right by the main entrance there, because Shiloh was occupied in the Roman times, there is the remains of a first century tomb. So we got to actually go down and go right into it to see what this first century tomb looked like. And it's different than, different shapes and different styles than the tombs that they used in the first temple period, hundreds of years before Jesus. So a first century tomb might have a rolling stone like this. By the way, these are not the tombs of Jesus. These are just first century tombs that are illustrative of those types of tombs. This one is actually on the road to Megiddo, and it is a rolling stone tomb. Only 2% of the tombs in Israel have from the first century are rolling stone tombs. 98% are what we call square plug tombs. They're just a square stone that you flip down and it plugs the hole and you flip it back. So that's the vast majority of them. But there were rolling stone tombs, and the Bible is specific that Jesus was buried in a rolling stone tomb. So it would look like that on the outside. On the inside, you would see a burial bed, as you can see in this photo. On the right, that's where they would lay the body out. And then when they came back a year later to gather the bones and put them in the bone box, those ossuaries, they would take that ossuary and then they would put them in these little niches. Now, this particular one only has one, but many of the tombs from the first century almost look like your hand. There'd be the main area where there would be a bed or maybe more than one. And then there would be all these little niches spreading out, and they would put multiple ossuaries in these little niches. And that's how you can tell you've come across a first century tomb. Well, when you go to Israel, there are 3 tombs, but I'm not going to talk about one of them because it really doesn't have very much evidence for it. But we'll talk about the other 2 tombs because they're the 2 tombs that people go to. The first is the Garden Tomb. The Garden Tomb is a beautiful, beautiful tomb. It was the very first place when we landed. Our hotel was literally a 5-minute walk, honey, from the Garden Tomb, and Jen really wanted to go see it. So we went to the Garden Tomb, and it was beautiful. They have done that up nice. That's not the tomb of Jesus. Any archaeologist will tell you that because it's an Iron Age tomb. That's probably 600 years old by the time Jesus was walking in Jerusalem, not the new tomb in which no one had ever laid. And it doesn't look anything like a first century tomb. But it's a great place to think about the tomb of Jesus. I have a friend who says it's the right feel, but it's the wrong site. And that's a good way to put it, because the tomb that's probably the tomb of Jesus is the wrong feel, but likely the right site, or at least the best candidate, and that's the church. That's the tomb that's in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The problem is, it doesn't look much like a tomb now. What happened was the history of this site, and by the way, the history of this site starts in the 1880s. The history of this site goes all the way back to the 1st and 2nd century. In the 2nd century, the Emperor Hadrian put down the Second Revolt, and the story is told by Eusebius and Jerome that what happened was he buried that tomb, because Christians were going there to worship. He buried it, put a platform over top, and built a pagan temple to Jupiter and Venus. And that stood for 180 years until Constantine came along. Constantine becomes a Christian. He takes an interest in Israel, and he goes back. He sends his workers there because the person who was the bishop of the church in Rome at that particular, or in Jerusalem at that particular time, they remembered where that site was, and they took down they ripped down the pagan temple. They dug down, and they found a tomb. And so what they did was they built a structure around it, not this one, but an earlier version of it. And if you go inside the tomb today, what you will see, you kind of go through this door, and you will see this burial, this limestone cover, which is covering that burial bed that is underneath it. It was opened for the first time in 500 years, back in 2018. And so we know that there is a burial bed under there. And when they did the renovations, they put a little window in so that you can see that enclosed in that marble, it's called an edicule, this marble shrine, actually are stone walls from the 1st century from a tomb. Probably the right place, but it doesn't look like it. Or at least I would say the language I usually use is it's the place that it's the best candidate we have for the place where Jesus was buried. Again, a known place with a history that goes all the way back to the 1st and 2nd century. We're not talking about fables and legends that grew up hundreds and hundreds of years later. We're right back on top of the actual event with this particular place. All right, 3 more to go. Let's just talk about this one. This is going to be the one that I probably get the most questions about, the Shroud of Turin. The Shroud of Turin is a very, very famous artifact. People believe that it bears the image of Jesus on it. I don't claim that. I don't know that you could ever claim that or prove that. In fact, in the 1980s, there was a very famous test of this particular artifact that they dated it, radiocarbon dated it to the Middle Ages. Now, if you know anything about the Middle Ages, you know they were selling all sorts of relics, and you would pay to go see relics, and people were inventing relics, and I don't know how many pieces of wood that would have made up how many crosses that people sold as the real piece of the cross that you can buy. Wink, wink. The problem with that particular test was they said, don't do it from that corner where they repaired it in the Middle Ages. Do you want to guess where they did it? From that corner where they repaired it in the Middle Ages. And they did testing on a particular, these strands of linen that those were the only strands that are different from all the rest. It just was a poorly done test at the time. More recent studies have been very interesting. They have noticed the absence of lignin, a chemical substance that disappears over time from linen. And when they calculate how much is left, it appears to be a very ancient cloth, far older than the Middle Ages. There is residue from a rare type of limestone that is common to Jerusalem that was discovered on it. A recent study showed, here's the thing, people sometimes say, well, it's just painted on. It's not painted on. They know that there is blood on there. And they were able to test some of this blood just a few years ago, and in it they discovered nanoparticles that are only present in tortured victims. That's very interesting. In 2022, there was a new study from an institute in Italy that used wide-angle X-ray scattering as a way to measure it, the degradation of the cellulose in it, and it matched a first-century date. So here's my take on the Shroud of Turin and why I think it's important. I think that it is an authentic burial shroud of someone who was crucified in the first century. We know from studying it that he was crucified. You can see these white marks are blood on the wrists. You can see some down here. On the other side of it, I'm just showing you on the front. On the other side, you can see the back is scarred with whip marks. And people say, well, see, that's exactly what happened to Jesus. Yes, it is. And hundreds of other people who were crucified by the Romans in the first century. So all I'm prepared to say, and I tend to be someone who's a little conservative by nature, and within ABR, I tend to be a conservative person, trying not to stretch the evidence too far. And so I think that it's an important artifact that can teach us about crucifixion, that it's an authentic burial shroud from someone who was crucified in the first century. That's all I can say. But it's important because it shows us that the description of how Jesus was crucified is consistent with what we know about crucified victims in the first century. All right. The Nazareth inscription. As background, there's this interesting record in Matthew 28. It says, and when they had assembled with the elders and taken counsel, they gave a sufficient sum of money to the soldiers. This is after Jesus has risen. And they said, tell the people his disciples came by night and stole him away while we were asleep. And if this comes to the governor's ears, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble. So they took the money and they did as they were directed. And this story has been spread among the Jews to this day. This is an ancient edict. Emperors would make these edicts and they would have them carved in stone, and then they would put them up for all to see. And this particular one, we believe, comes from Nazareth. And it is an edict in which Caesar declares the death penalty for anyone who steals body from sepulchre-sealing tombs. Now, Romans largely cremated all of their dead. They didn't bury them in sepulchre-sealing tombs. That's what Jewish people did. So it's directed to Jewish people. Why? You have to stop and ask yourself. And this, by the way, we think dates to about the middle of the first century, so probably the Emperor Claudius. You have to ask yourself, what historical situation could there be that would cause the ruler of Rome to issue an edict for the people in what is now Israel, saying, stop stealing the bodies? People robbed tombs in antiquity, but they didn't steal the bodies, they stole the grave goods. And I believe that the best explanation is that this is a reference to the crucifixion. Now, some people go, well, how in the world would Claudius in Rome ever hear about this? Guess who Claudius's good friend was? Herod Agrippa. They were good buds. They were raised together because the Herods were often sent to Rome to be raised and got to know the emperors and were on good terms with them. So I have no doubt that Herod or that Claudius had heard about Jesus and issued this in response. In fact, some scholars have gone one step further to say that it was this proclamation that gave the Jews the right to kill James, the brother of Jesus, because he was killed. Josephus, the Bible talks about that in the book of Acts. How would they have the right to do that? If Claudius had issued this particular edict, and James, as one of the leaders of the church in Jerusalem, was accused of spreading this misinformation, they would have a legal right to do that. It all connects together. The final one, and I'm going to cheat and group a bunch here, are our manuscript evidence. There's an interesting account at the end of John where Jesus appears to his disciples and he says to them, put your finger here and see my hands, he says to Thomas, because Thomas has doubted. And put out your hand and place it in my side. Do not disbelieve, but believe. And Thomas answered him, my Lord and my God. See, we're deity of Christ right back in the first century. Now, here's the interesting thing. We have ancient manuscripts. The latest evidence that I have seen, a new book published in 2022, I think, called Rethinking the Dates of the New Testament, argues that all of the books, all of the Gospels were written before 70 AD, sometime between 45 and 65 AD. So we're talking within 30 years of the actual event. These are being written down. And we have the earliest manuscript would be a little fragment of John called P52, but it's from an earlier part of John. The earliest manuscript we have from that talks about the risen Jesus is this particular manuscript on the right. This is one of the first pages of it. It's a near complete Gospel of John. The back pages are damaged, but we have this section, John 20, 37 to 41, recorded on this particular account. This is an important discovery that was made, because it shows us that when we go all the way back to the 2nd century, we have manuscripts that have been copied from the originals or from ones that were copied of the originals. But here's the thing, it's not just the gospel writers that talked about this. Secular historians wrote about it too. Josephus wrote this: "At this time there was a wise man who was called Jesus, and his conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. And many people from among the Jews and other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die, and those who became his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them after his crucifixion and that he was alive." If you know about this particular passage, you know that the Greek version of it, a Christian scribe in antiquity added a few things to make Jesus look really good and make him look like he was God and the Messiah. Not the kinds of things that Josephus would have written, but this is an ancient Arabic translation of it, and it doesn't have any of that. So most scholars think this is the authentic one that Josephus wrote. He reports the death of Jesus and the purported resurrection of Jesus as his disciples went around talking to others. He's a Jewish writer. Roman historian Tacitus wrote this: "Nero fastened," here's the context. The context is, if you've ever heard the phrase, Rome burned while Nero played fiddle. He was accused of starting the fire of Rome because he wanted to build his palace in an area and the people wouldn't sell him that particular area, so he burned it down. That's the story going around, and Nero's not happy about this. Tacitus, writing about 116, wrote this: "Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus," that's the Latin form of Christ, "from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty," that's crucifixion, "during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome." That mischievous superstition, I believe, is a reference to the resurrection. That's how the Romans would have seen this story of Jesus being raised from the dead that Christians were going around telling. So we have, again, ancient writers that affirm what the New Testament says. So why does this matter? This matters because I believe that understanding the historical reality of the Bible can build someone's faith. I remember speaking at Camp Oshpakung once, and I was talking about the historical evidence for some of the people who were named in Scripture. And afterwards, this girl came up to me, and her eyes were this big, and she said, "Oh my goodness, it's true. It's all true. The stories I heard in Sunday school are true." And I thought, good heavens, because I knew this girl. I knew her parents. I knew that she was taught this at home. I knew that she went to Awana. I knew that she went to summer camp every day. And she's harboring these secret doubts that any of this is true, because it just seems, I don't know, like fiction. Luke wrote a book, the Gospel of Luke, and he wrote it for a man named Theophilus. And he said this: "Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those from the first who were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Therefore, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, it seemed good to me also to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught." One of the reasons I'm passionate about archaeology and I'm passionate about my work with ABR is that there is a biblical principle that good research about the history of things can build people's faith. That's what Luke is saying. And that's why I think all of this is important, particularly when it comes to the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. The Bible is telling us accounts of actual people, authentic places, and accurate history. So just a couple of things, free resources. I like free stuff. ABR's website is a great place to go. My little part of it is the breaking news section. I write a breaking news column every week, and we upload it to that particular section. If you want to stay up to date on the latest happenings in biblical archaeology, you can go there. Or if that's too much of a hassle to go there weekly, I summarize the top 3 at the end of every month on my own blog, BibleArchaeologyReport.com. And so those are some free resources for you. I also have a resource table up here. The Bible and Spade magazines are by donation only. Whatever you can give, just put in the little jar there if you want some of those. We have some pottery we brought back from Shiloh with us. It's 2,000-year-old Roman pottery. You are welcome to take a piece with you for the road if you want. We brought back a whole bunch in our suitcases, and there are some other replica artifacts here you can look at as well. So I'll just take any questions if there are any questions that anyone has about anything related to biblical archaeology. It can be Easter, can be Shiloh, can be anything else you've read or heard about. Don. I don't know if it was underground, but it was excavated. And when we were there, so it has been excavated, and you can read the excavation reports. I read Joan Taylor's summary of the excavation report. Unfortunately, when you're there, when you walk down into it, like many places in Israel, they've turned it into a church. So you go down in the cave, and they've paved the paving stones on the floor, and those paving stones, I think the article said, are about 2 feet above the original level, so you can't see the remnants of the wine presses because it's been turned into a church or a chapel facility there. And so, but it was excavated, yes. And you can see some of the diagrams of where things were. If I go back, I'm going to take that little picture with me so that I can go in the cave and kind of stand about where those particular installations were. So if you ever go to Israel, and I do encourage you to go, most tour groups will go to the Garden of Gethsemane, which you walk up this little road, and kind of a steep road, and it's on your right, your entrance. Just before you get there, on your left, there's another entrance to a different shrine, and you can take it, but then just look for these little signs that say the Grotto of Gethsemane. So, yeah. Yes. I'm not exactly sure about when they did it. It looks fairly modern. And a lot of the buildings, so the way they did churches or the chapels at that particular time is there was a whole wave of building chapels in what's called the Byzantine period, so between 400 and 600 AD, 400 and 600 years afterwards. And then a lot of them have been either updated or new ones have been built in the mid 1800s to the mid 1900s would be, and I suspect this one dates probably 50, 60 years ago, would just be my guess based on the stones that are there. Although it's misleading because everything in Jerusalem is made out of stone. It's amazing. So, and some of those stones look beautiful and new, and they're 500 years old. So it's hard to guess. Yes, David. Alrighty, so that's a good question. Who decides who and where to excavate? So all of the excavations in Israel are under the auspices of the Israel Antiquities Authority. And so you don't get to dig in Israel unless you get a permit from them. And so ABR gets their permit from the Israel Antiquities Authority. Things are a little more complex when you're digging in the West Bank, which is where Shiloh is, or Shiloh. And so we've got just a slightly different level of organization there. But again, you get your permits, and so it's really over everything. It's the Israel Antiquities Authority. They're the ones who decide who gets to dig where, and usually there's an application process, and usually you have to demonstrate that you've got the resources to be able to do an excavation, and some are quite small. There's one I've been following for about 6 years now at a place called El Araj, maybe 7 years. At El Araj, which I think is probably the site of the ancient lost town of Bethsaida that's in the Bible. And their first few digs, they might have had maybe 20 people in the dig. We were taking 2 buses every day the second week at Shiloh because we had close to 100 people, sometimes over 100 people digging with us at Shiloh. So in terms of what I'll be doing, we're going back to Shiloh this year, Lord willing, and we're going to be digging in the same area again. So we're we're looking at all of the different occupation levels. The one that really interests us is that late Bronze Age to Iron Age. So the time of Joshua, when the Israelites enter the land, probably sometime in the late 15th, early 14th century BC, and then through to the time of the story of Eli, which would have happened 1150-ish BC. And so we're going to be digging in an area, I'm hoping, that we dug last year. My friend Jordan is the square supervisor there, and for at least one of the weeks I'll be his assistant square supervisor digging in that area. That's the area with it's a burial pit of late Bronze Age things that have been sacrificed. So bones and pottery and even a few pieces of gold have been found there. And so we'll be digging there again. And my wife does a lot of work at the wet sift station. So we dig, and if we don't find anything there, we take all the dirt and we dry sift it and see if we find anything there. And if we don't find anything there, we take it down to the wet sift and they spray it, because maybe that little piece of rock isn't actually a rock. Maybe it's a clump of dirt that's been hardened over thousands of years, and when you spray water on it, dissolves. And 2 years ago, we found a gold star that way. It was missed in the dig, it was missed in the dry sift, but it was found in the wet sift. And so Jen spends a lot of time at the wet sift there. So that's what we'll be doing, hopefully. Yeah, so we dig with these little, I should have brought my stuff to this evening. So it's basically just a little trowel that you use, and you do scraping layer by layer is how you do it. If you get to a hard area, you can use, I have a little hand pick that I use. And so just to kind of break stuff away if you're trying to do it. But the whole goal is you've got a team and you're digging in a square that's about 5 meters by 5 meters, but you have 2 walls a meter. So it's 4 meters by 4 meters you're digging, and you're trying to take it all down at the same level like a bathtub draining. And so you've got a group of people who are scraping. So last year, the first week we dug in a different square, not where the late Bronze Age stuff was, but we were digging in a Roman level, so 2,000 years old, time of Jesus. And I was given one little section. It was about this big, this wide, and about 4 meters long, maybe not quite, that I was working on the one side of a wall. So I was on one side of the wall, other people were on the other side, and you just, yeah. So little trowels that you scrape stuff in, and little paint brushes that you dust stuff off. And if you love spending 8 hours a day on your knees scraping in dirt with a little trowel, archaeology is for you. So yes. Yes. Yeah, and we'll often have sometimes, I think once while we were there, the Israel Antiquities Authority person came around to inspect. They do come around to inspect. Also, you have to file reports with them every year, and a final excavation report is supposed to be published within, I think it's 5 years of the completion of a dig. So we finished our dig at Kerbet El Macater 4 years ago, 5 years ago, and we just published the first volume, second volume's done. So we made the deadline. The reality is there are lots of digs over there that they dig and dig and dig, and we still don't have anything. I'm waiting for, I'm doing my thesis on Jericho, and it's been 9 years since the end of the dig by the Italian-Palestinian group there, and we're still waiting for the final excavation report. So sometimes the lead excavator dies, and then you have to wait for it to, I mean, Kathleen Kenyon dug at Jericho in the 1950s, and the first excavation reports were published in 1981, I believe. So, I mean, sometimes they don't make it, but we try to. So, yeah. Dean. Of the artifacts or the site? So it depends on where the site is. Our particular site at Shiloh is overseen by, if you've ever heard of these Jewish settlements in the West Bank, there's a Jewish settlement by Shiloh, and it looks after the site of Shiloh, the ancient Shiloh, and they run it as a tourist site. So ours is like that. It depends in Jerusalem. We walked by a dig from can't remember what university, Chapel Hill in, I can't remember what state it is in the States, but I was taking pictures of their dig site, and it's just lying open outside one of the city walls in Jerusalem. So in terms of the artifacts we find or that are found, they all belong to Israel. So they are kept either by the Israel Antiquities Authority or in where we are by Kamat. It's in the West Bank, and so your stuff is kept there, and it's great that it is kept in places like this. So when we were over there, I wanted to look at some of the artifacts from Jericho that were found in the 1930s in the excavation there, and I was able to go to the Rockefeller Museum. They took me down into their basement, which is the IAA warehouse, one of their warehouses, and I was able to study some of the pottery in person that had been found almost 100 years ago there. And so it's there for, some of it goes into museums. A lot of it stays in storage, but scholars have access to them and you can study them. And so, yeah. And of course, there is the antiquities trade that goes on. If you're in any other country, you're not allowed to buy antiquities, but in Israel you are, as long as they were discovered prior to 1970 something. And I'm just amazed at how much stuff there still is in stock that was discovered pre-1970 something. Interesting. So, but generally that stuff has been not found in excavations. It's been what we affectionately call night diggers who come in and to a site and try to find stuff to sell on the market. So, yeah. Good. It depends. I'm not sure what it's going to be like this year. I think with what's going on over there, there is an increased security. I know we've talked to one of our friends over there, and she's told us that certainly on the road up to Shiloh, there's an increased security. Where we are, Shiloh is a great site because it's gated. And so you can actually just leave your stuff out overnight. And the worst you have to worry about is you get there the next morning and someone from the village of Shiloh has come to borrow the wheelbarrow and you got to go get it and bring it back. That's the worst that you have to worry about, but you can leave your stuff out. Whereas at other sites, the site we dug at last time, you couldn't do that. It'd be gone. So yeah, often there isn't security. At the tourist sites, there are. So there is security. If you go through the old city of Jerusalem, you will see police officers in their with their automatic weapons slung around them in groups of 3 or 4 here or there. So there's lots of security in Israel, but in terms of guarding specific sites, if it's just an archaeological dig that nobody's there at anymore, no, probably not, unless it's a really important one. Last call for questions. Well, thank you for coming. And I will stick around. And if anyone wants to come up and chat some more, I'm happy to stick around and chat. And I'm happy to answer any questions about some of the stuff. Feel free to grab a piece of pottery there if you want. And I would be remiss if I didn't encourage everybody to come on out on Good Friday morning to our pancake breakfast too here at the chapel at 9 o'clock. Men, you can show up at 8 o'clock to help set up and get things ready. So ladies, you don't have to. You can enjoy the time off. So there we go. All righty. All the best. Have a wonderful Easter. Thank you.